Admiral, I want to change to the major story of the day. 2 days ago, the Russian bounty story broke in the New York Times. I spent yesterday talking to, I don't know if you did, but I did, senior White House and non White House officials. The bottom line, the president was not briefed on this because his CIA briefer did not deem the intelligence verified, and not one agency outside of the government believed it was verified to the level to warrant presidential alert. And the intel people inside the White House shared that assessment. Now, I don't know what you've learned about it, and please tell us, but generally speaking, you know Mike Morrell, I know Mike Morrell, you know how the president's briefing works. Sometimes they read it. President Obama was a reader. Sometimes they get it personally. Vice President Cheney, President Bush, President Trump are listeners. If you're not briefed on it, it's not in the river going through your head. Have I accurately described the intel process?
Yes, you have, and certainly have a lot of personal familiarity with the presidential daily brief. When I was Secretary Rumsfeld's senior military assistant, I sat in every single morning while Secretary Rumsfeld was given the precise same brief that the president was receiving. That went on for over 2 years. As the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, I had regular access to it. So I'm very familiar with the process. I think you've described it accurately. It does vary from president to president. People do absorb information in different ways. I will say this, Hugh, and I think you'd agree with this. The report, if true, is extremely shocking. And I think, I know, had I been Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and in charge of that mission in Afghanistan and had seen that intelligence at whatever level, I would have sent that like a rocket to my boss, the Secretary of Defense at that time, Secretary Gates. And I'm reasonably sure Secretary Gates would have immediately asked the president to convene a National Security Council meeting at the highest level to deal with it. Because, again, if true, and it certainly has the earmarks of the GRU on it, if true, this requires a pretty significant response, in my opinion.
You and I agree, but the if true part is the key predicate there. My sources tell me they don't believe it's true, and that you don't take the president that which they do not believe to be true. And my sources are really good. Now, I do believe there's motive. The motive is I go back, and I'm sure you remember in February of 2018, 300 Russian paramilitaries came over the hill in Syria, and none of them went home. In one of the most vicious firefights of the Syrian campaign, Russian paramilitaries were wiped out by the combined American special forces and air forces brought to bear on their ill intentioned and really ill conceived attack on an American outpost. We wiped them out. I would assume, Admiral, that there are some Russians who lost brothers and fathers and cousins and friends in that attack, and they would like nothing more than to get some payback. Is that a fair assumption?
I think it is, and I'll take you even further back. Go back 30 years ago, Charlie Wilson's war in Afghanistan. The United States is supplying the Taliban with surface-to-air missiles, which turned the tide, frankly, and managed to shoot down many Russian aircraft. When I went to Moscow as Supreme Allied Commander, I had a conversation with the last general to come out of Afghanistan from the Russians. And he made a point of saying to me, you Americans have Russian blood on your hands. So sure, you can go back in history and find plenty of motive for this, although the incident you described correctly in 2018, I would say was squarely self-defense. Those were mass troops coming at U.S. Special Forces. That's a very different situation than putting individual bounties on the heads of American soldiers. Very
And
different in both cases.
I'm just saying that they would have motive. Some people in the Russian military and the GRU would have motive. And they might
No
also have
question.
motive just to drive us out of Afghanistan. And there might be within America people who want us to stay in Afghanistan for whom this story would be convenient as the president edges towards leaving. And so I think there's motive to falsely overinterpret data. And I always think one rule, we did not interpret correctly weapons of mass destruction data in 2001. You've sat in on these briefings. I'm sure you've heard how people, I used to do it in justice, the level of certainty is a finely tuned needle that people dial up and they dial down. I'm sure, Admiral, you've heard this like 1,000 times, right? People hedge their bets. So the question is, if we really thought Russians were putting bounties on Americans, would it not be incumbent upon the director of CIA and the DNI to go to the president and say, Mr. President, they're killing Americans. Putin is killing Americans. Would they not be obliged to send up a red flare?
Absolutely. And so I think one of the questions that we have to ask at this point, if we take the president at his word that he was completely unaware of this, is did his team let him down here? And I, for one, as I look at all of this and look at the reporting, I would be asking the question, if I were the president and had not been informed of this, why was I not informed? Even if the intelligence was not fully baked, Hugh, because it's so explosive and it is of such high potential to create exactly the situation we're seeing now. So you kind of can't have it both ways and say, well, the intel isn't really that good. We shouldn't have brought it to the president, and say, space there that I think needs to be explored, frankly.
That's what I explored yesterday with an adamant comeback to me from serious sources. No, it was not serious. It's not believed. And if Gina Haspel is called to testify on it, John Ratcliffe wasn't there at the time. She will say it's not good intel. It's not confirmed. If we buy my assumption, Admiral, just buy my assumption for a second, what should the New York Times do with a story where it's alleged that it is good intel? What should they do?
Well, I think the New York Times, like any news outlet, does have an obligation to print only what they can source from multiple levels. And I think the New York Times has sourced this well, because that's the standard of journalism that they generally adhere to. You can have the conversation about whether they should have brought the story forward or not after, in my opinion, we do get, at least in front of Congress, the senior officials, unlike you and I, who actually saw all of that intelligence, who had to make those hard decisions. I think that's a fair set of questions to ask. Here, I look to the Congress to take a look at this, and I think you're going to see that in the next few days.